So in this lesson, we're going to take a moment to look a little bit at how our brains work. You might be wondering why that's relevant when discussing improving the conversion rate of a website, but trust me, it's absolutely crucial. That's because our decision-making process is intrinsically linked to how our brain is wired. And that means if we want to encourage people to act in a certain way on our websites, we need to know how they think. You see, we're not nearly as rational, intellectual being as we like to believe we are. And in truth, much of our thought processes are still driven by our evolutionary roots. We share a lot more in common with our animal cousins than we like to think. In fact, much of our behavior is still driven by the most ancient part of our brain, often known as the reptilian or primal brain. This primal brain has many fascinating features that impact our behavior, even in today's modern world. Characteristics that we need to be aware of when designing a website intended to encourage action. If we jump back a few 100,000 years, you'd find that the primal brain was crucial for our survival. It helped us assess danger and controlled our fight or flight response. What's interesting is the way that it went about assessing danger and still does today. One of the techniques it uses is to judge whether something is familiar or unfamiliar. Everyday things tend to be safe and preferable, while strange things are potentially dangerous and so treated with suspicion. And that has immediate ramifications as we create our websites. By ensuring that our sites feel familiar, it feels safe. Creating familiarity is a tricky balancing act. You could use it as an excuse to copy the competition or well-known sites like Amazon. However, that would be an oversimplification. Equally, we could use it to suggest that we should never redesign our websites. And it is true that website redesigns can create a sense of unfamiliarity, but that's sometimes exactly what you need if you're trying to shift a user's attitudes towards a company. However, as I say in other lessons, that doesn't mean we could never redesign our sites, no matter how unfamiliar that might feel. Instead, it means that when we do redesign, we need to do so with care, ensuring that there's a sense of familiarity with what went before and with other related websites. We can also create a sense of familiarity with the experience itself. If your site behaves a certain way at one point, it should do that everywhere. Nothing's more disconcerting to the primal brain than shifting in layout or changes in navigational labeling. But the way the primal brain assesses threats isn't its only unusual characteristic. There's another aspect of its desire for self-preservation that we should note, and that's its desire to hoard. The primal brain evolved in a world of scarcity, and despite the fact that we now live in a world of plenty, it hasn't really moved on. That's why we feel the discomfort of loss twice as intently as the pleasure of gain. The primal brain fears losing something. Unfortunately, when we ask people to act on our website, we're almost always asking them to give up something. That might be something as apparent as money, or something more abstract like personal data. But in either case, the primal brain is going to be reluctant, and we're going to have to work hard to demonstrate an overwhelming value that they will get in return if we're going to avoid getting an adverse reaction from the primal brain. One way of doing this is to focus on the benefits our products or services provide, not just its features. Listing features requires us to think and to make the leap into how they might end up helping us. The primal brain isn't very good at that kind of connection. However, if we focus on listing the benefits a product has, then the primal brain feels less of a sense of loss. For example, the Apple website doesn't merely list the specs of its Mac, it talks about how the Mac can be used and how it can help people in their lives. And that makes it a lot more valuable and a lot more evident to the lizard brain. Fortunately, there's one aspect of our primal brain that actually works in our favour, and that's the fact that it's abysmal at planning. You can even see this in toddlers because they rely a lot more heavily on their primal brains. Offer a toddler one candy bar now or two in an hour and they'll almost always take the immediate reward. From our perspective, as we seek to encourage people to take action, we can use this lack of planning to our advantage by delaying the cost of acting. For example, if you allow pre-orders on your site, don't take payment until the product is actually released. You could even delay payment on immediately available products through financing or some other payment scheme. The primal brain is less concerned about future fees than it is about the here and now. A great example of this is the Save More Tomorrow campaign. Most people, despite knowing they should, don't really save for their retirement. That is because the long-term gain of saving is too abstract for the primal brain when compared to the short-term pain of losing that monthly payment. The Save Tomorrow campaign deals with this issue by getting people to sign up to start saving at some point in the future. For example, people might commit to start saving when they get their next pay rise. The results of this approach were dramatic, encouraging a considerable percentage of people to start saving, and that's because the primal brain fails to respond to a hypothetical future cost. It's simply too abstract for it to process. If you run a charity website, the potential of a Give More Tomorrow campaign is immediately obvious, isn't it? As charitable giving is hard for the primal brain to swallow, despite the fact the majority of us want to do it, at a conscious level at least. But the primal brain is not the only aspect of our thinking that we need to know. There's also the rather interesting roles of System 1 and System 2. In the superb book Thinking Fast and Slow, we're introduced to these two modes of thinking, called System 1 and System 2. Most of us would associate System 1 with our unconscious thinking, the kind of thinking that's fast and automatic. It's autonomous and efficient, requiring very little energy or attention. For example, System 1 is used to recall a fact like what's the capital of France or the answer to 2 plus 2. It also allows us to make instinctual decisions based on very little information. Opinions like how trustworthy somebody is or whether you can safely overtake in a car. At face value, System 1 appears to have superpowers, but it is prone to error because it takes shortcuts to achieve its incredible results. For example, it regularly replaces a complicated question to answer, such as, is this person trustworthy, with a simpler one. Does this person look like someone that I have found trustworthy in the past? It also tends to ignore information that is not immediately available. Instead, it's more concerned with a believable story. So, for example, if I told you that a person called Jim was quiet and studious and had a fantastic attention to detail, you would almost certainly swallow the story that he's more likely to be a librarian than a farmer. Now, that's understandable, as the description that I gave of him fits that stereotype of a librarian. But what your System 1 is ignoring is the fact that there are 20 times more farmers than librarians. You made the assessment purely on what you knew and chose to ignore the fact that you might not have all the information. What this teaches us is that we don't need to overwhelm people with too much information in order to persuade them to act. The tendency is to add more and more information to our sites in an attempt to convince people that it's worth taking action. But in fact, too much information can overwhelm System 1, and what that does is wake up System 2. Now, System 2 is what you'd probably describe as your conscious mind. Although it's much slower than System 1, it's much less likely to make mistakes. It's more deliberate and analytical, enabling us to answer more complex questions such as what is 28 times 6 or learning a new skill. The drawback of System 2 is that it's slow and takes considerable energy when compared to System 1. It's also much more detail orientated and tends to be a lot more suspicious. And that's a problem for us as we're trying to convince people, because people are more likely to overanalyze the decision that you're asking them to make and ultimately fail to act. System 2 feels like too much effort for a task as supposedly simple as using a website. It also makes us more hesitant, meaning we're reluctant to act in the first place. One upside of System 2 is that because it uses a lot of effort, we tend not to use it for very long. We use it sparingly and as quickly as we can shift a reoccurring task from System 2 into System 1, which is why we often talk about muscle memory when referring to things like driving a car or riding a bike. It's also why sites like Facebook or Amazon feel so intuitive. We've used them so much that we now can use them without even waking System 2. You might be wondering at this point why we should care about System 1 or System 2, and the answer is that far more of our thinking and decision making happens in System 1 than we might think it does. We want to believe ourselves to be irrational decision makers, but we're not, and that impacts how we need to build our websites. We can't rely on people to be logical when using our sites. You will quickly find that if you want your website to be as valuable as possible, you'll need to have a firm understanding of how people think and how they make decisions. And that is a theme that we'll be returning to again and again throughout this masterclass. But for now, thanks for watching.